Born as Michael in the early 1930s in a country battling itself in regards to its morals, Martin Luther King Jr. was preordained to become one of the United States' most important historical figures. His legacy continues to grow as men and women around the world continue to follow in his gracious footsteps to shed light on the flaws still hidden within today's justice system. While fighting for the God-given rights not completely granted to African American individuals at the time, King pummeled into conflict after conflict and at one point even saw himself in jail. In 1963, King was leading protests, which seldom became violent, in Birmingham, Alabama. Unfortunately, his efforts proved unsuccessful as protesters were hosed with water and attacked by police dogs. Many were injured and arrested during the protests, but what caused an even larger predicament was the lack of bail funds. King and his posse of activists were not nearly as prepared as they may have thought, thus leading to their eventual arrests. It was then that King arrived at his cell and penned the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, whilst being tried in court for violating an anti-protest order. His letter simply explains that people have the responsibility, moral or not, to eradicate laws that are unjust to the common individual. Here, King writes, quote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly," end quote. His words struck a chord with the townsfolk, as most of his scriptures served as an account of the many journeys taken to achieve civil liberty. King's words carry a rather simple motif, and he makes it clear that what he is saying is true, especially with what he wrote prior to this quote. His intentions lie within the words, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," end quote. This, in layman's terms, simply insinuates that if we, as a collective assembly, differentiate each other based on our physical characteristics, then the differences we emphasize will be our own demise in the future. We cannot think of each other separately from other people around the world, as we are the human race. The actions we perpetrate will affect others, and what others do could or will affect us in the near future. King himself even states that those who reside within the United States should, quote, "never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds," end quote. On the other hand, he is not exactly saying that we must simply ignore our differences entirely, but to embrace them, and to simply follow the golden rule. Treat others how you would want to be treated. Seems rather understandable and rational to believe, but according to King's testimony, it was quite the opposite. During his detention, the clergymen criticized King's nonviolent protests in Birmingham, saying they, the African Americans, should pick their fights in the court and not in the streets. They concluded their rant by explaining that the issues at hand were caused by the outsiders participating in the protests. This eventually led to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter, which pulls apart and dissects the clergymen's rickety claims against the African Americans. To say that Martin Luther King Jr. made an impact in the civil rights movement is quite the understatement. His endeavors eventually proved successful, as his words shine gold in students' textbooks across the country, and perhaps even the world. Legally speaking, the United States has improved tenfold. Serving as a tangible account of the long journey to freedom, the letter helped influence positive changes to laws that govern common towns and cities. For example, segregation of public water fountains and restrooms in Birmingham was terminated. This in particular may not sound like much, but small steps led to an ample amount of dirty laws being ameliorated to fair, more stable edicts. Moreover, King's letter only represents a fraction of his accomplishments, with some including his leadership in the Montgomery bus boycott, Birmingham protests, and, most importantly, the Great March on Washington, in which he helped lead over 200,000 people in protest of inequality against African Americans. It was then that King spoke his mind and read a 16-minute speech known as "I Have a Dream," which, as a result, changed the course of history for people living in an oppressive era.